Вітаємо вас на всеукраїнському.
May welcome you at Ukraine Theory Forum. These days we're discussing the topic of de-oligarchization and the combating corruption in Ukraine. All those topics we're going to discuss with the experts and the high officials today at our forum Ukraine Theory.
Вітаємо вас на всеукраїнському.
Welcome at Ukraine Theory Forum, oligarchization and combating corruption. This is the topic of our discussion today. Dear ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine. Thank you very much. Good morning rather than good afternoon. It's my pleasure to see all of you here. I just experienced the wish to tell you something that I mean to say that even people can start to recognize people even covered with mask. I can see the prosecutor general for some reason without a mask. Maybe you're not afraid of any kind of infection contaminated disease. May I once again welcome all the participants and the esteemed guests. Our topic today is very important, a powerful topic, which is entitled de-oligarchization. It's not something new for Ukraine. It's not new to our society. Among the old-time politicians, indeed, it's very difficult to find those who would not promise the people, the Ukrainian people, to fight against oligarchs in order to ensure the growth of the economy of Ukraine. Instead of that, the year in, year out, the number of the fighters increased, fighters against oligarchs, and as did the quality of the oligarchs proper. The reason is obvious. Children cannot cut off the arm of their parents, the arm which actually their parents' arm, which created them, which brought them to the power, and actually they were fed by this hand. And those hands, for the first time ever during the years of Ukraine's independence, instead of the promises, we switched over to the real actions in order to overcome or to leave this kind of closed loop and vicious circle of the impact of the oligarchs. The essence of this circle is rather obvious and simple. Oligarchs, they accumulate illegal capital. Very often the capital, or part of that capital, is spent for the creation, promotion, and the further maintenance or support for the politicians at different levels of clerks in order to further increase or multiply the same capital, the part of which again is spent for the support and maintenance of the same clerks and politicians, both oligarchs and the politicians, and politicians oligarchs, or oligarchs politicians, we can find those as well. They really believe that this matter, decision is kind of the, let's say, is going to work forever. It's going to be perpetuum mobile. But they did not take into account very important, let's say, the variables, the state and the citizens, which are of different mind, and actually who declared this position 2 years ago, and they do that every 5 years. The only authority or power in Ukraine is exclusively the people, the Ukrainian people, over 40 million citizens, and not just several or few persons. And those, the latter, take advantage of the weakness of the state institutions and really the corruption. They actually obtain the resources, assets, preferences, privileges in order to multiply their own power for their own enrichment. While today they use those assets and that wealth against their own country. They try to influence, to effect everything at the same time. And the approval of very important decisions, both in the Parliament of Ukraine, the adoption and approval of the decisions regarding the nomination of the ministries, managers of the state-run enterprises in all the sectors of our economy. They actually took decision or decided who is going to watch which kind of TV channel and what exactly the program they're going to see and how to spend different funds in money and different other things. It's not invented, or it's not invented. I mentioned all these because starting from now, everything's going to change. All we want to have the comprehensible, transparent, and single rules for the whole of Ukraine. Irrespective whether you're a small scale entrepreneur or the big tycoon or a foreign investor, the rules are going to be equal and the same for everyone. Everyone has to understand that all the judicial power and the courts must be independent, not only of all other branches of the authority, but independent of the big business, political parties, mass media, the civil servants of all levels, judges, law enforcement officers, supervisory boards of the state-run enterprises, all of those must function without the support or the influence of this big oligarch capital. Oligarch. It's very important. The big business is a normal thing. This is the right thing. This is cool. This is powerful. What is not normal, to become a big-time business when you either take something illegally from the state budget, or you just underpay something to the same budget of the state. It's not good or it's not normal when this something is measured not in millions, but already in billions of hryvnia. It's not normal when this big business controls separate or individual branches or sectors of the economy or dictates the rules to the whole country, to the market of this country. We want to have the country of the normal operating rules, operating laws of the specific economy, independent mass media, open, free, etc. That's why I made the first steps, and I believe this step to be very important, to, let's say, to disassemble or to eliminate this effect or influence of the oligarchs in our life on the future of the Ukrainian state. I'm talking about the law on oligarchs. And this law is just the beginning of the road. This is truth. This is the foundation of the future regulatory basis, which is going to have the top priorities: protection of the interests of Ukrainians, in protection of all the interests of all the taxpayers against the state institutions, including the combating the corruption and the anti-monopoly actions. Myself and all our community and society, we are looking forward to very clear legislative initiatives which have to introduce efficient, effective antitrust instruments in order to combat this oligarch system. All without any exceptions. I'm talking about all the officials, especially if you're talking about the MPs. They have to recognize the responsibility and the liability if they forget who is their employer, so to say, who actually nominated them, who voted for them, who actually allowed them to decide for the whole country, and who pays their salary. This is the people of Ukraine. It's the letter who those officials and clerks have to serve for and whose interests they have to defend. And we are talking about the support on the part of the 40 million strong population in Ukraine, and this support instills let's say, the assuredness in myself that in this road we are just doomed to success. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, and have a very nice forum.
Дякуємо, президент.
Thank you, Mr. President of Ukraine.
Далі вже президент України
Now the Mr. President is going to communicate with the representatives of the leading mass media, and the Ukraine Third Forum is called up to just to provide the answers to very comprehensive and complex, difficult questions. And our speakers, the participants in our forum, has regularly communicate with the representatives of the mass media and this audience. And during this jubilee year of the 30th anniversary of independence of Ukraine, we are going to discuss 30 different topics on this stage. Those who cannot actually attend our forum physically because of the quarantine or the COVID-19 pandemic, you can actually follow our discussion on our website. We have this panel discussion which you can follow both at our YouTube channel and in the website. Dear ladies and gentlemen, Prime Minister of Ukraine, Mr. Denis Shmyhal. Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen, esteemed participants in our today's forum, esteemed colleagues. I'm happy to welcome you for another time, not for the first time. For a year, the politicians and the public culture discussing what hindrances are the road of Ukraine to become an advanced country, developed country in this world. Somebody is talking about some difficulties in the economy, the lack of this economic strategy, the too high taxes, and maybe everybody is right, but everybody supports the fact that the system of economic relations, which has been formed a long time ago, actually slows down our development and actually minimizes the chances for Ukrainian miracle. We are talking about the oligarch-based system of relations, which actually ties the hands of for the development of our economy. We are talking about monopolism and the pressure on the law enforcement agencies and the relation between the public the authorities and the law enforcement agencies and business. And nobody did anything just to break the backbone of the system, and this system of relations has nothing to do with the creation of the successful country based on the competitive relations. Neither for the team of the president nor for our government. None of them can work under such conditions, circumstances to build this successful Ukraine. Initiated by Ukraine, anti-oligarch law is a bright example of this. That's why we welcome and support the initiative of President Zelensky when at last we are going to separate business from the politics, when we are going to create equal conditions and terms to become the foundations for the successful development of economy in our country. One of the lines of the oligarch system of regulations in our country is, of course, corruption which actually created imperfect tools and instruments, the lack of reason and wisdom and the different situations. That's why the government today focuses attention on the necessary conditions which will create such circumstances and conditions which will rule out the possibility of corruption to develop. We require institutional transformations for the success of this anti-corruption. Success is the development of market relations and creation of new competitive markets, reform the fiscal and control agencies, significant decrease of the state share in the economy. We were talking about that for a long time. We have representative of the state property fund, and we started several years ago this small-scale privatization, and the budget received more money than the accumulated, let's say, revenues coming to the budget for the two previous years. But in any case, small privatization, the open and the green field, proved to be successful. This plan, we have the big-time privatization. We are going to sell 7 big, large facilities, and the international experts are unanimous that this is one of the largest anti-corruption steps. For many years, this was the source of the illegal enrichment. Open and transparent privatization will turn the situation by 180 degrees. The communities will get new jobs. The state will get these direct revenues to come into the budget, and for the further increase of the taxes. Those strategic enterprises which the state plans to leave as its own property, we are going to enter the corporate reform. As you know, those enterprises will have better quality management and efficiency. It should be noted that our strategic intentions regarding the decrease of the distribution or redistribution of GDP through state budget, those plans has been registered and fixed. Recently, we actually adopted the budget declaration, which demonstrates the redistribution of the GDP through the revenues to the state's budget from 23.8% to 21.6% as it's declared in the budget declaration. It means that more funds will receive the business and our citizens, and we expect that this big business will reinvest those funds into the development of their businesses and creation new jobs. I believe that the owners of the big export-oriented business will heed to these words and will support the economy of our state after the Corona crisis. Another vector which I wants to the development of the market relations and creation of new markets. At last, we started to move systematically to the creation of a new systemic market. We launched several years ago the natural gas market. We continue to work for the citizens of this country. We actually cancelled the PSO for the respective companies. For many years, the politicians were afraid to do that because there were different interested, let's say, entities, and now this market works in full-fledged manner. It's very important to create a competitive environment at the gas market and other markets like power market. We believe that this will stimulate further development of this market. Speaking about electric power supply, we continue our work to connect the Ukrainian power grid to the European power grid, which will allow us to create the market without any manipulation, and our own will actually support our standing on this market and create new conditions for the people and the business. In 2 weeks from now, we are going to launch the land market. This is the first step, but this historic step, because the citizens of Ukraine will be free to dispose of their own property. The next step is the reform of fiscal and law enforcement agencies. This bureau will include the analytical center, which will make it possible for the new body to combat the shadow schematics. We are going to do that. That the bureau of the security will become a new chapter in the relations between the state and the business, and the analytical approach to the work and the priority. And the cabinet minister is going to focus its attention on this issue. As Mr. President Zelensky mentioned, we are going to create the same rules of the game for the small, big business in this country. This is our objective in order to create a really successful economy, successful business, which is going to fill the GDP, fill the budget, and create new opportunities for our country, for our state. That's why an extremely important topic of this forum of today, and I may wish successful work to all of you. We have a lot of international partners and experts today. I really wish you a very fruitful and successful discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. And indeed, we are going to discuss further the experience of our international partners and bringing back the illegally obtained assets, the so-called asset recovery. The Basel Institute of Management Director of International Center for Asset Recovery, Greta Fenner, is our next speaker. Please.
Good morning. Mr. President, Prime Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and most importantly, dear people of Ukraine. It's a true privilege to speak to you this morning and to be part of Forum 30, which leads up to a very important day, the celebration of 30 years of independence of Ukraine in August. I'm very sorry I cannot be with you in Kiev today, especially as I was in your beautiful capital just last week. But on the topic of today, corruption and asset recovery. Talking of these topics in the context of celebrating your country's independence is extremely pertinent, because independence and the fight against corruption are closely entwined. Let me give you examples. If a country is captured by vested interests and corrupt crime groups, then democracy fundamentally is at stake. And I believe you would all agree that democracy has been the goal of Ukraine's independence. Second, it is essential that anti-corruption institutions can act independently. If they are at risk of undue political or economic interference, they lose their ability to effectively combat corruption. And third, when grand corruption is widely present, criminals steal large amounts of public assets. President Zelensky, your Prime Minister, have referred to that. As a result, the country lacks resources to invest in important public services and infrastructure. The country and its people are impoverished, and they become dependent on foreign aid. Reducing corruption and getting stolen assets back is important for Ukraine, because the country urgently needs this money to build schools, hospitals, roads, and to invest in job creation. But it is important for another reason too. Asset recovery is considered a particularly powerful weapon against corruption. And when I say corruption here, I mean grand corruption, the kind that siphons off millions and billions from your country. If law enforcement is successful in recovering stolen assets, in depriving criminals of their stolen assets, the crime of corruption is all of a sudden much less attractive. And while it is also important to put corrupt people in prison when found guilty, it hurts them a lot more if you also take their money away. So the efforts of Ukraine since 2014 to recover stolen assets are very important from both a social and economic development perspective and from a criminal justice perspective. My organization, the Basel Institute on Governance, has had the privilege of supporting Ukraine in its efforts to recover stolen assets since 2014. When very shortly after the Revolution of Dignity, the Office of the Prosecutor General asked us to assist with finding and recovering the money that was stolen by former President Yanukovych and his allies. And this cooperation was reinforced again last year with the signing at the occasion of the visit to Ukraine of then Swiss President Simonetta Sommaruga, of a tripartite agreement between Switzerland, the Office of the Prosecutor General, and the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, underscoring the cooperation of Switzerland, Ukraine, and my organization to recover stolen assets. Since 2014, Ukraine has recorded progress, but I believe the progress has sometimes been much slower than we have hoped. Let's start with the positive. The first very positive development immediately after the Revolution of Dignity was the international reaction. Switzerland, which by the way finances our work in Ukraine, the European Union and other important financial centers have immediately frozen assets suspected of having been stolen by the regime of former President Yanukovych. The intention of this international action to freeze these assets was to give Ukraine time to investigate the underlying crimes, to prove that the money stems from corruption and ultimately to confiscate it so that it can be returned to Ukraine. But these orders, freeze orders, are not open-ended, and foreign countries cannot return the money to Ukraine without the help of Ukraine. Through our work, we were able to help advance cooperation between Ukraine and the countries where assets have been frozen. These countries have provided Ukraine with information about bank accounts, other evidence. But now the ball is largely in Ukraine's camp. It's the Ukrainian institutions that need to finish investigating and then prosecute the cases, and the courts that need to confirm the criminal origin of these assets. Only then can the other countries release the funds and the money can be returned to Ukraine. And with that money, schools can be built, or roads, or hospitals. Let's not make a mistake. Time is absolutely of essence now. We may have another 2 or 3 years until most of these foreign asset freezes will expire. That means that Ukrainian institutions have to work at full speed and have to be allowed to do so, so that we can see successful prosecutions and confiscations in Ukrainian courts. For this, Ukraine does have the necessary institutions, and this is another positive development since the Revolution of Dignity. In addition to the Office of the Prosecutor General, these include, as you know very well, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor, two institutions with which we work closely and who are very important for this country. There is also, of course, ARMA and the National Agency for Corruption Prevention and the State Bureau for Investigations. And in this context, I am particularly pleased to confirm that we have just signed a cooperation agreement with SBI last week when I was in Kiev. And of course, last but not least, the High Anti-Corruption Court. These institutions are all very important, but they have an incredibly difficult job. Investigating cases of grand corruption is very challenging. Expertise in this field of asset recovery is rare, and the criminals still have vast resources which they are using to pay for some of the most experienced defense attorneys to make the job of NABU, SBI or OPG ever more difficult. And on top of that, it has been hard to watch how over the years a whole range of homegrown, Ukrainian-grown obstacles was put in the way of these critical institutions and how they continue to suffer greatly from instability brought to them from the outside. In the 7 years that we have been supporting Ukraine, we have worked with 5 different prosecutor generals, some of which more, some less reform-oriented. This is a real problem for the stability of this key institution and has, at times, definitely had a negative impact on its performance. Adding to this problem is the fact that key anti-corruption institutions have not had a chief for a prolonged period. The positions of head of SAPO, of ARMA and of SBI have been vacant for far too long, and the selection process for head of SAPO, in our view, is in serious trouble. This is not to suggest that the acting heads of these institutions are not doing a good job. They are doing a very good job in many cases. But the lack of a designated chief adds to the instability, and it truly puts into question the will of some to enable these institutions to be effective. And last but not least, as you know, there have been something like 18 attempts to remove the current director of NABU from his position. And nobody will make me believe that this is because he's so bad at his job. Rather, allow me to argue it is because he is a threat to those who have a reason to fear him and NABU. In addition to all this, we have had one backlash after the other when it comes to reforming Ukraine's legislative framework. The decision by the Constitutional Court to rescind the asset declaration law is very problematic, for example. The law on illicit enrichment, which was passed in Parliament just recently, is sadly a poor replacement for the previous law. It has serious weaknesses, as confirmed by the Venice Commission, and it will make it extremely hard for investigators and prosecutors in their efforts to stem out corruption. And finally, ample evidence of serious corruption in the Ukrainian court system may well be the final straw to Ukraine's efforts to recover the billions of hryvnia that have been stolen from Ukraine, stolen from the people of Ukraine. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this is a make or break moment. If we are not successful in recovering these stolen assets, then people will lose patience, they will lose hope, and they will lose trust in this country's institutions again. Because it will seem to people that the corrupt continue to get away with their crimes. And it can seem like an invitation to others to also start stealing. Corruption may seem only one of the many problems of this country has to grapple with. But you should remember that corruption is at the heart of pretty much any other problem you are facing. Corruption fuels conflict and is known as a serious threat to national security. Corruption fuels organized crime. Corruption destroys the health system. Corruption leads to poor education. Corruption leads to poverty. And it is no exaggeration when we often say that in many ways, corruption kills. Mr. President, Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, this is a critical time. The international community, and my institution included, continues to support you in your efforts to fight corruption and recover stolen assets. But we must see sincere efforts in Ukraine. We must see that there is an end to the undermining of the independence of key institutions. We must see these institutions with strong leadership. We must urgently reinstill independence, impartiality, and professionalism in the court system. And we must pass legislation that is up to international standards and that can work, not legislation that undermines the anti-corruption drive. This is what we hope to see from the politicians in this country, and I sincerely hope that they will show that they have the best interest of the country and of the Ukrainian people at heart. I trust and know that you do, Mr. President and Prime Minister. We are here to help, and together with our partners in NABU, at OPG, and at SBI, with our partners in Switzerland and across the world, we will continue to stand by your country's side to end impunity for corruption and hopefully return many of the stolen assets to Ukraine so they can be used for the benefit of the people of Ukraine. I thank you for your attention.
Дякуємо. Якою є протидія?
Thank you. What is the, let's see, measures to prevent corruptions in this case? The floor is given to the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Irina Benediktova. Good morning, Your Excellencies, and good morning, esteemed participants in this forum. Well, indeed, we have a most critically important topic today. The topic, it seems to me, with which we live every day in our life. Corruption is kind of corrosion in the state machinery. When there is corrosion, the movement of any kind of mechanism is impossible. It means you have to stop down, and you just have to wait when the complete disintegration comes. The efforts on the part of the law enforcement bodies and the prosecutors are aimed at the everyday combating this negative phenomenon, of course, which is in the way of the Ukrainian development. On every day, we submit at least 11 cases about corruption-related violations and breaches. As compared to the previous year, its number increased by 20%. It's more than 3,000 already. We have positive dynamics. We already can see the increase of the criminal cases which are submitted to the case, which amount to 1,300 today. First of all, we focused our attention on the combating the illegal, let's say, the abuse of the office and the illegal appropriation. We have at least 50% more cases sent to the court, more than 500,000, and we based on the principle of irreversibility of punishment. We actually sentenced 620 corruptionists, and today number, even this year, half a year, increased by 50%, and amounting to 350. And sometimes it takes years upon years to consider this or that case in the court. And this became the real sentence in our combating corruption based on our successful story of the existing higher court of the judges. We have to disseminate this positive experience everywhere. We should not concentrate only on the anti-corruption institutions. Sorry, it cannot work like that. When some have to combat according to their functions, and others just observers or take an active part in that, but only using some slogans and some words. They're just talking about some kind of steps to be taken. In order to achieve tangible results, the whole community of Ukraine has to stop take or give bribes. We have not only combated the effects of the corruption, but first of all with its sources and reasons. I'm talking about the oligarch system and untamed bureaucracy. And in the life of the country, we have not only oligarch but also post-oligarchs situations. We can combat or fight the corruption not only during the TV shows, but also in your offices. And later, I hope we will be able to actively demonstrate that during the court hearings. And the specifics of such combat or fighting, it has nothing to do with the nanotechnologies or rocket science, but political maturity and our conscience. The problem of dependence of these state officials on the influential and rich businessmen who are used to be called oligarchs is much more serious than it could seem at the first glance. I can try to briefly explain the reasons which allow our team to demonstrate our political will. We don't have these skeletons in our wardrobes, hidden skeletons. We are not dependent on those people. We do not have the long-standing relations with those. We did not provide them or give them any promises. Moreover, we are going to fulfill our own promises given to the citizens of Ukraine. The illustration of preparedness to cut the oligarchs from the politics and to eliminate the possibility for them to influence the political lives of Ukraine is as follows. The President of Ukraine prepared and submitted to the Parliament of Ukraine a respective draft law. And the politicians, actually the officials will have the free of charge vaccine against they strive to have a beautiful life. And unlike the coronavac vaccine, you have just to have only one injection. If it doesn't work, then the patient will be sent to a very long quarantine from which they will never return to the politics. Another one, we have to investigate into the criminal cases which are related to oligarchs and their business interests. The task, honestly speaking, is not a simple one, but we already started to produce some fruit or achieve the results which Ukraine has been waiting for decades. I can assure you, looking through your eyes, that neither myself nor my colleagues from the Prosecutor General Office, we are not going to hesitate to do something if we see some kind of charge and accusation against this or another influential person in Ukraine. We are going to sign the respective document. Yes, we are talking about the oligarchs, and in no way we are afraid of those terms or this term, which could be more confirming if you're talking about our preparedness to combat such problems, then they signed suspicion document, nothing. So we are prepared to give the green light for the investigation of the criminal cases of any level of complexity. Whoever is the subject of suspicion, I don't think there are any grounds to think in different way. First of all, I'm interested in the criminal case, not the kind of the background against around the oligarchs. And this is no surprise for you, I believe. You understand that there is no kind of register of criminal cases, prosecutions against the oligarchs. Usually it takes in the kind of the oligarch main course, and they start to prepare the expert conclusions. The judges started to fall ill, and prosecutors sometimes they come up with such rulings after which you do not even want to shake their hand, If you are talking about the oligarchization, we have to be guided here by the following. We have to go from the general to the individual. It was individual to influence the critical activities in the state, which is more important to preserve this for a long time, using the legal instruments, legal approaches. If you're talking in terms of responsibility, the terms of let's say, when without that it would be very difficult to come to those old approaches, but we attentively look at everything, and in the near future we are going to provide the society with the answer to the question, where is the de-oligarchization if the code and criminal procedural code, how much they paid for their position, how they let's say, use that position, etc., etc., etc. And the law enforcement agencies close their eyes on the following things: the real owners and managers of big businesses. Very interesting question, and I hope to get the answer to that. Also speaking, we take care of the very serious inspection of the criminal cases. We are talking about the special register. We have 7.5 million open cases, and those which are still under our attention is 1.5 million. And may I assure you that we are not just talking about fighting for the clean streets. Every morning we take care to clean the streets, and I hope that we can do that together with you, and we won't have to wait for another decade. Thank you very much for your attention, and may you have every success in this forum. Thank you. This floor is given, and to declare the common position of the ambassadors of G7 regarding the initiative and the organization, I have the honor to invite to this stage the Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Federal Republic of Germany to Ukraine, Madam Anka Fedkuzen.
Доброго дня всім. Дуже дякую за запрошення. Це дійсно велика честь для мене тут стояти і теж говорити в імені моїх колег від Великої Сімки. Я мала дуже мало часу підготувати до цього виступу. Це не моя рідна мова, але я сподіваюся, що ви мене слухаєте, чуєте і розумієте. Дякую для цього. Ми, як Велика Сімка, взяли до відома законопроект.
We actually took in for consideration the draft law which was mentioned by President Zelensky, which the President of Ukraine submitted to the Parliament. We welcome the decidedness and the resolution of the President to resolve this. I don't know whether to resolve the problem, but to combat the in-depth, the rooted impact of the oligarchs on the political and the management of managers of Ukraine, mentioned the economic life of Ukraine. For 11 years, not in a row, but I've been working in Ukraine, and this kind of the serious problem associated with the oligarch impact has always been here, and we have to put the end to that. We don't know what would be the destiny of this draft law. This depends on the decision taken by the MPs, members of the parliament. But there is something which has been already mentioned. First of all, we are talking about the state institutions and the trust and confidence in those institutions. They say that to live in Germany, it's sometimes it's not really funny. Sometimes it's not so funny. But maybe it's good, But we have very good high trust in our institutions. But to do that, we have to strengthen those institutions. You, like myself, you read the results of the polls in Ukraine, and the biggest confidence and trust is in the army and the church. This is very important because the army defends the country against the enemy in the eastern parts, and this actually provides the spiritual strength to the people. The church, but those institutions cannot resolve economic or political problems in the long run. Different institutions have to take care of that. As Prosecutor General mentioned, that the supremacy of law, independent judges, courts and law enforcement agencies, and civil servants, of course, who must be selected and nominated as a result of the transparent contests and competitions, and we expect such a transparent selection. Only in this way can find the best and the most integral on those people to occupy those very important positions. In addition to the judicial reforms, there are other components. We are talking about the Anti-Monopoly Committee, AMC. It's been in existence for a long time in Ukraine. It must be strengthened further, must become independent. We have to provide the political backing for that, for them to provide them the opportunity to fight oligarch interests in their own sphere. What's very important is independent mass media. Germany and the other countries, we support this kind of the society support. Well, I agree. In Germany, we also sometimes think that this maybe is not very interesting, but we believe that it's very important to take care of carrying out the proper and right analysis. The third component, in my opinion, is the impact on the society. The society must force the political elite and the civil servants to follow the proper rules of the game, to play with those rules and not against those rules. I would like to cite an example of our country. If you remember our former President Wolf, he actually took the loan, not really on the easy terms or not the privileged loan from his political friend, 500,000 euro for the building the house. It was a modest house. He returned that money, all of the money, but he never mentioned that. But then the mass media got to know about that. And only this kind of bad taste or aftertaste that he got something with the help of his political friend, that was an argument for the society, for the independent media, to exert such a pressure that he actually started to lose all the confidence and trust, and he was forced to, let's say, to resign. Only because of the loan he took, and he completely paid back. This was our former president, the highest moral authority in my country. Another example, during this pandemic, COVID pandemic, some of our MPs helped their political friends to sell the masks to some other countries. There was there was more or less legal action, but they started to lose the trust. They actually lost all their, let's say, offices in our Bundestag, and they are going to lose their mandate altogether because the parties decided not to nominate them any longer as MPs, as people's deputies. As you can see, even there is no criminal liability. If the people lose their moral reputation is enough. In the people who occupy or have such offices, they must know about that. In the end of my speech, I would like to say, sometimes they say that we criticize Ukraine too much. We know that. I always strive to say, take our criticism, the constructive criticism. We want you. We want to help not the specific government, the specific president. We just want to help you. And the president mentioned that this is most important for the Ukrainian people because the Ukrainian people are the employers in this country, the top employers. I believe that in 30 years, everything will be okay in Ukraine. It takes time, but it seems to me that Ukrainian people deserves better life and faster. And this year we are going to celebrate the 30th anniversary of independence of Ukraine, and I'm positive that Ukrainians shouldn't wait another 30 years. And this is for the improvement of their life. This is the reason why all of us, we have to act along those lines. And the president made the first step. And it's very good. I believe that the discussion has been started, a real discussion. And do hope, although this forum, or the forum like that, will have the people in the street to discuss all those issues, to recognize, understand, comprehend their own role in this fight. And I'm sure that you are going to achieve success in this. Thank you very much for your attention. Well, now we are going to switch over to discussion on the main stage with the experts, the top officials, representatives of different of the Verkhovna Rada and the ministries. In a few minutes from now, we are going to start the first session of it today, countering or combating oligarchic influence. Vladimir Zelensky offers 4 criteria to define oligarchs. This is a person who takes part in political life of the country, influences mass media, is the end beneficiary of the economic entity monopolist, and has the confirmed assets exceeding 1 million of the minimum survival kit. The cost of the medium assets is not taken into consideration. The oligarch has to meet 4 criteria out of 4.
Це Всеукраїнський форум
This is All-Ukrainian Forum Ukraine 30, Economy Without Oligarchs, and we continue our deliberations for this day. And this is a panel discussion now. We have experts already on the stage, and the moderator of this first panel is Olena Moshenets MP, Deputy Head of Parliamentary Committee for Anti-Corruption. I helped you with wishes fruitful fight against oligarchs. So we are discussing counteraction for oligarchy. We have heard great presentations from President, Prime Minister, Prosecutor General, and our international partners. It is very important to continue our discussions internally to navigate ourselves in this specific steps, using Mr. Danilo's expression, to dismantle this oligarch system. And looking into the issue, we can see that this distance was at once covered by Western countries, Asian countries, with different activities, but the destination is the same. It's efficiency and societal welfare or prosperity, because oligarchy is about absorption of resources, access to specific representatives, specific types of rent. This is the added value not being reinvested in the economy, what it is then generation and reinvestment for sustainment actually absorbs the funds that might be used for development of the domestic product. Let me introduce our guests here. Alexei Danilov, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Alexander Novikov, Head of the National Agency Prevention of Corruption, Mathilde Menard, online Deputy Director on Finance and Entrepreneurship of Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, Mr. Milovanov, President of Kyiv School of Economics, advisor to Head of the Presidential Office, and Mikhail Saakashvili, Head of the Executive Committee on Reforms. Well, Mr. Danilov, let's start with you. You embody this threat to oligarchs. We know how many people come to the screens of their devices, if not less after the meetings of the National Security and Defense Council, for your briefings, after your meetings, and potentially the register of oligarchs can incorporate another 13 people, as we hear. So we would like to put it to you, why your council decided to lead this very important mission to fight oligarchy in Ukraine, and what we should we expect in the nearest month, well, if not years. Well, I would like to say that you might be mistaken in seeing me as the locomotive of this echelon. I can say that the head of the council is President Volodymyr Zelensky. He actually navigates us in all the developments. We cannot imagine any meetings without him. All the decisions that were implemented by us are initiated by Volodymyr Zelensky, our president, and that's how he enables all these developments. Secondly, I would like to make a specific remark for the sake of the people. This economy without oligarchs, I would say that the name should be country without oligarchs, because economy is just part of our society, of our operations, societal operations, and oligarchs have impact or undermine not just the economy. It happened in 1998, the first big money coming to the parliament when they were electing Speaker of the Parliament. After the elections of 1998, we had that fussing around the position of Speaker, and Mr. Medvedchuk became Speaker of the Parliament, and he's a well-known politician of today, and we understand how it all started and when it all started. That all started as registered back in 1998. And we have to live with it. We have to live with it with difficulties because, why? Because these things prevent us from developing our country. And when we say and when we read in the Constitution has contains this aspiration to become a member of NATO for Ukraine. If we have the oligarchs in the economy, the corruption component as a result of this, unfortunately, our ticket to NATO cannot be picked up. And this is fundamental. This is why the President is very much concerned with this issue presently, because accession to NATO, membership in the alliance, is a token of our independence. Now, we have a very menacing neighbor. We have had this war for 10 years now, and we cannot overcome the aggression because for some time, instead of building up the state, the oligarch model for development of our country was instead devouring our resources, our state, and opportunity for business people to do business. If you are not one of the oligarchs, you cannot be in that club and get some privileges free of charge because of this special relationship with the authorities. And we can see more than 20 years since 2001, they have been undermining our country and infecting it with corruption. And we have to get ready for our membership in NATO. And after adoption of the said law, I hope everything will be arranged. And when we have behind the curtain certain discussions, certain names mentioned, President Zelensky was the first to dare to make it public, to make the name sound, with the repercussions for the people to know the names of the people we call oligarchs. But as of lately, we've had this hue and cry, and a lot has been discussed because of the political parties. It should be done. This is not constitutional. And, well, I'm very surprised to hear such discussions, especially among the MPs. And the President emphasized that that was to be a test for them as far as the Ukrainian people is concerned. And the promises to be kept, the promises were to fight oligarchs and how ready they are to keep that promise. In terms of number, it will depend on the final version for adoption of this law, and then we'll be able to discuss who falls under such process. That will be very public, absolutely transparent, and there won't be any hidden agendas. And we have 23 people, representatives of the parliament, Speaker of the Parliament, the National Bank representatives, Office of Prosecutor General, Irina Benedictova herself, Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs, so all the people currently at the helm of the state are participating in this process. And believe me, there are very hot discussions, very heated discussions, and it is not always unanimous. Everything is discussed and voting as of lately has been unanimous indeed, but that is always preceded by very active discussions. I can see that from inside, and quite frankly, I think that this is going to be one of the most difficult laws in terms of number of amendments. That can be compared with the land reform, but this is a very important draft indeed. And at this point, we have to proceed, we have to progress. I have another question for you. At this point, do you feel that the oligarchs feel the threat to their assets in this draft? Well, first of all, they understand that it's never going to be the same. It will never be the same. But the law should not be sterilized. It should not be negated by amendments, because President Zelensky is setting the course and initiating this process. And I would like our deputies, people's deputies, MPs, to be quite responsible, so that we avoid the situation when, after the adoption of this law, no decision of our council can change their lives, even with the presidential will. So it's it's now the ball is on your yard. I mean, MPs, to fight this a disease that's infected all our spheres of lives and walks of lives. There's no other way, I'm sure, and the MPs should adopt the rules. If we discuss NATO countries, you can hardly find, or wouldn't find, any country with oligarchs. There are wealthy people, we need wealthy people, but they have no right to buy MPs, to buy ministers, to buy positions, to buy licenses. By the way, we are going to solve the issue of utilization of natural resources. All these fuss should be stopped, and the chaos should be stopped when people have insider information and buy it for money. And of course, staying close to politics has so far been the best business in Ukraine. Mr. Novikov, they say that you are related to one of the most effective managers of the you are called, sorry, one of the most important and the most successful managers of the agency that you represent and you lead. You fight corruption. That's your mission. Can you fight creating new oligarchs? Can your agency do anything about it, and what is being done? We know that the anti-corruption strategy is being prepared for the second reading. The specific steps and directions outlined there. Well, corruption is the use of, or rather abuse of power in favor of some private interests. Oligarch influence is the use of power for private purposes. So we can see that these notions are synonymous. Our agency are sure that fighting oligarchs is not the end state. The end state here should be a fair society with accountable government. Why this cannot be achieved with fight? If the rules stay the same, we will just the change of names. And Alexei was right suggesting that we have to turn people who are oligarchs, being both big business and big influence in politics. They should be confined to big business and competition, fair competition with SMEs or any kind of business. So national agency have all the instruments to achieve this goal. First of all, we administer the register of declarations, and we check declarations of individuals, which, according to the draft law anyway, have to be regarded as such categories. Last week, we launched a system of automated check of 800,000 declarations, 100 declarations of we started checking them. Out of the 110 people fall under the definition of oligarchy according to the draft law. Now we also have to check the reporting system of political parties. What's the point? The states is there to finance political parties, and they are also there to control the other sources of finance, individuals and corporations or companies. That is for the sake of our society, not one specific financial industrial group. And with that purpose in mind, last month we launched the register for such reports. The reports are to be checked in an automated way and to avoid any influence from the financial industrial groups. The National Agency for Prevention of Corruption, NAPC, have all the instruments to prevent the illegal oligarch influence. For the parliament, there is a question because they suspended submission of reports from the political parties. The draft is motioned by Alexander Kanonenko. The point is that NAPC is result-oriented. We have all the toolkit for that. We cannot employ or engage the toolkit, but we need to employ and engage certain things to not just talk, but do like oligarchization. In 80% of cases, the cabinet ministers and the parliament take into account the anti-corruption examination findings, the gaps in the legislation, and the resolutions are used or rather abused by financial industrial groups to illegally influence power and to have the oligarch to exercise the oligarch influence. And last but not least, still September, we've had these anti-corruption strategies pending with the parliament. The committee has already recommended for the second reading and adoption. It contains all the answers to the questions as to how we should make the government not corrupt and secondly, independent from influence of financial industrial groups. Just three main points. Number one, the lobbyism law for the parliament, regulating business influencing power. Secondly, less burden for business, for small and medium enterprises to become bigger and to compete using the level playing field. And thirdly, the judicial reform, not commencement and continuation or reset, but conclusion of this reform. The Parliament, the drafts on the High Council of Justice, High Qualification Commission of Judges, the drafts are contain the key for conclusion of this reform. And during the previous panel, Prosecutor General mentioned that there are no convictions. High Anti-Corruption Court is the only forum demonstrating sufficient dynamics. In June, we had the special session of the General Assembly of the United Nations dedicated to the action on UN Convention against Corruption by different jurisdictions. Our position is very powerful on that list. We have IT instruments, we have Prozoro, we have register of declarations, we have register of political parties, the system of their vetting and checking on the anti-corruption institutions, NAPC, National Anti-Corruption Bureau, High Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, and High Anti-Corruption Court. The only thing that we still need, is time for the institution, for the mechanism to start working and to operate efficiently, to demonstrate the efficiency. We have scores of convictions at the High Anti-Corruption Court with real imprisonment. All the other courts with 6,000 strong force cannot compete with this result. So what is missing? We have to turn down fabrication of drafts on dismissal of head of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, director of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, or block my agency for the check of reports of the political parties. Tomorrow they will review 52, 53 drafts. Until this number is signed by all the heads of factions, and this is putting a ban on such checks. We need just 3 points to dismiss that, and that will de-oligarch Ukraine, make it free of oligarchs. For different reforms, for different purchases, we actually assigned to them the mission to cover this distance, and let's hope that everything will be adopted and we will together be able to reach the result that is desirable for us. Our next speaker.
Now I'd like to give the floor to Madam Matilda Minari. I really would like you to share with us, with international point of view on the events on the reform on the general speaking anti-corruption strategy of ours. From the point of view of Europe, of our partners, whether you are satisfied or maybe not satisfied, what do you expect of us in the next months or years to come? Madam Minari, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm very pleased to be here with you this morning. I'm sorry not to be in Kiev, but I hope we'll all be able to travel again. So the OECD is indeed very honored to be invited to be part of this very important discussion you have today. And I hope I will build on our long-standing collaboration with Ukraine in the areas of competition policy, governance, SOE governance in particular, but also corruption and integrity. So Ukrainians have been debating the power and influence of these oligarchs for a generation, but you're not alone. I mean, across the region, obviously, but also around the world, the high levels of inequality and increasing levels of inequality, as well as the concentration of control of productive assets, have profound political and economic consequences. And even if Ukraine is a particularly striking example, this dynamic is hardly unique to Ukraine. And we see dominant economic actors that often shape politics in ways that further enhance their economic power. We see also this in developed economies. We see how tech giants, for example, fight against antitrust actions, and also how they resist attempts to reform digital taxation these days, while engaging in practices that suppress competition. And this defense of market power by entrenched incumbents reduces innovation, reduces entrepreneurship, and ultimately reduces growth. And we know for sure that politically this can subvert democratic governance and undermine state effectiveness. Whereas in Ukraine, state institutions are still relatively weak and the rule of law has not firmly taken root, such domination of the economy also tends to fuel corruption, and it can lead to the wholesale capture of state institutions by vested interests. So the proposed anti-oligarchy law under discussion today represents one response to this challenge. And we all know that designing tailor-made legislation that correctly identifies the subjects and behaviors to be regulated, and also does so in a fair, transparent, and effective manner, will not be easy. There are many pitfalls ahead, and many here know them much better than I do. But that's not what I want to focus on today, because to our view, the critical point to bear in mind is that no new law functions in a vacuum. And the impact of even the best drafted legislation will depend, in fact, on Ukraine's success in pursuing a range of other reforms designed to deliver better governance, more open markets, and a truly level playing field in politics as well as in economics. And they are indeed the reforms on which the OECD and its partners have been working in Ukraine since the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. And let me mention just a few key priorities. First, we need a strong antitrust and competition policy. It is critical to ensure that markets remain open and fair, particularly via merger control and abuse of dominance proceedings. And we have worked with the Anti-Monopoly Committee of Ukraine for some years to advance this agenda. And I would like to highlight three key elements here. First, the institutional independence, that is critical, because we know that competition authorities need to be empowered to exercise their powers with independence. And this requires ensuring that managers, for example, are appointed strictly on merit and cannot be removed without cause. It requires, secondly, sufficient resources. Public authorities charged with implementing competition policies need to be remunerated with salaries that attract and retain the right expertise, and also to reduce the temptation to engage in corrupt dealings. And third, ensuring that competition authorities have proper enforcement tools and powers. And only through the threat of investigations and deterrent actions, sanctions, can competition policy have impact. Otherwise, the committee will be weak at best or worse, an instrument that can be used by powerful interests against actual or potential competitors. The second point, the second area of reform that is critical is the reform of state and enterprise sector. And this is another area where the OECD has worked intensively with Ukraine with the support of Norway. Weaknesses in SOE governance create potential rent-seeking opportunities for well-connected business and political interests. And we have seen important steps in this area in recent years, but the reforms continue to meet fierce resistance. So Ukraine has committed itself to align with the SOE, aligned its SOE governance with the OECD guidelines on corporate governance of state-owned enterprises. And we are helping it to do so. But this requires, of course, both political will and capacity building. And there are two key points in particular that are, to our view, very important. First, it's to ensure that SOE reforms are entrenched in robust legislative and policy frameworks, and that reduce the risk of ad hoc changes, and to resolve also the existing legal inconsistencies. And the second point is to establish a professional ownership entity that either centralizes or at least coordinates ownership of state OEs, and that is at arm's length from political making and regulation to shield SOEs from unwarranted and ad hoc interventions. So, and cutting across all of these are the two other vital elements of the reform agenda. You mentioned it already, the need to strengthen anti-corruption institutions and policies to resist any attempt to undermine them. Ukraine now has some good legislation and institutions, but we have seen repeated attempts to water them down, and this must be resisted. We share with other partners of Ukraine the conviction that pervasive corruption, which is both the product and the source of much of the power of so-called oligarchs, has to be tackled in a systematic manner. And our anti-corruption network for Eastern Europe and Central Asia works closely with Ukraine's anti-corruption institutions, including the two ones in this panel. And we have in recent years looked specifically at corruption in the SOE sector, identifying pathways forward for Ukraine. So first, the fourth area of reform is public administration. The OECD EU Sigma initiative in this area has been working on public administration reform and public finance management for more than 25 years. And we have lent support to improve Ukraine's governance from the center of government. So all of that together, anti-competitiveness reform, SOE governance, anti-corruption, public administration, these are daunting reform agendas. The challenges are enormous, but so are, we think, the energy of the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government to build a better future for their country. So as at the OECD, we stand as your partner, and we remain ready to join you in this endeavor. Thank you.
Дякую. Дякуємо, пані Менар. Дякуємо в першу чергу за віру, за те, що даєте нам такий великий кредит довіри.
Thank you very much for your trust, first of all, that you give us a credit of confidence and trust, and we have to thank President of Ukraine, who became the leader in implementing this very important struggle against oligarchs. Mr. Milovanov, I would like to give the floor to you. A few years ago, we were talking about some anti-oligarch system, and we mentioned that any system comes sooner or later to this kind of oligarchy. Well, we are not talking about the power of this small group of people. Could be some kind of a sector, the fight for the access to the oil and natural gas. Maybe later we're going to talk about the access to Bitcoin or some other, let's say, currency. But this direction cannot be deregulated. Maybe you, as a person who has in-depth study of the economic theory and the novel definition and futurism, some of the events, maybe you can tell us how we can motivate the system per se to innovations. What we're going to do, that to be an oligarch is not prestigious, is not something which is really very important. Well, I'll start to answer a question from the far away. Cicerone was talking about democracy, monarchy, and the aristocracy. And he mentioned that the development of society, if it follows a bad route, then those types of authority, when the powers of the authority turns into oligarchy. Actually, we did not have aristocracy. We just had this kind of emergence of oligarchate in order to connect this with the reality. When I worked as a Minister of Economy, I'm just going to give you several examples how oligarchate operates. When I occupied the position of Minister of Economy, like the origin of the Minister of the energy sector, he was sitting next to myself. He did not actually took his phone, but the Kolomoisky could call him during the meeting of our government. This is not acceptable. Some of the MPs came to me. Some of the people were absolutely drunk. This was kind of the toll of their protection. For example, somebody called them before the meeting of the government. Some of the oligarchs called them to say how they should vote during this meeting. This is not acceptable. The state cannot exist in this way. In the democratic environment, the state cannot serve the people if there is such a pressure, non-transparent pressure. Me as a minister, sometimes they actually accused me that when I actually did not nominate the person who one of the oligarchs asked me to nominate, to select. And that was directly mentioned by the MP. The head of the committee said we have the problem because we did not appoint the one who actually was somebody tried to impose on us. I didn't have what to say the hidden tales somewhere in the media who can exert this pressure on me. Sometimes somebody tries to impact a certain circle of the people. They're not aristocrats, they're oligarchs. We have to stop this if we want to develop our country. This is not just, this is not fair, this is not correct at some basic level. But the problem is much more profound. It's not a small group of people we are talking about. About 3 or 6 months ago, when I occupied the position of advisor to the office of the president, one person called me who in fact is a well-known pro-reformist manager in Ukraine. For many, this is a kind of a big role model. He tried to blackmail me, asking to let's say, to invite this person or his company during our meeting with one of the presidents of some of the countries. I refused to do that, and I had to face some of the consequences. That person is not an oligarch. He's just a successful businessman who believes himself to be a reformer, a reformist, who writes very cool posts in the Facebook telling how we should develop our country. The culture when you can exert some pressure on the government because, for example, I have some ties or connections, who owes me something, in friendly manner or not so friendly manner. Why the company of this person has to get an access to the meeting with some president and other people representing other companies who do not know me, they do not have this chance. This is not correct. This is something alien to our culture. And this is just part of the problems. Another problem is the competition. And here I agree, from the economic point of view, we underestimate the situation. We were talking about the law enforcement agencies, about the, let's say, the Council of the National Council of Defense and Security, but we did not mention the Anti-Monopoly Committee. So the force goes in Ukraine not from the policy or the politics, but from the money, or their influence on the mass media. I'm not going to talk about mass media because this is not something I'm well versed in, but I can talk about the economy. When there is a big monopoly power in the market, we have the problem. Let's get the example of National Bank of Ukraine, the painful reforms, non-just reforms, but the oligarch pressure on the bank system, in the sense we had before the year 2014, we don't have this situation any longer. Before this reform, each oligarch had their own banks, and they were behaving not competitive environment. But now the banks are absolutely independent. They do not finance their own groups, and they do not exert the pressure in the interests of the oligarchs. They behave in a very acceptable manner, and the same must be provided for the real sector. And, for example, somebody may not agree with the National Bank, may not agree with the members of the supervisory boards if they do not meet the criteria. They maybe do not ensure the transparency of the business models. They should show how they make money. And we have to know who is really the person or the group of the persons who actually control the banks, who then provide the loans to who and what for. What we have today, we can see that for the first time ever in the history of Ukraine, we have the economic crisis, which is not financial crisis. I'm not talking about pandemic. The economy declined, but the banking system is not ruined. For the first time, when we had some economic, financial, or any other crisis, political or security crisis, in all those cases, we had the ruination of the banking system because it was an oligarch-oriented system. Now we have a lot of different problems, including the fiscal problems. We do not say that we completed the reform, banking reform. We have high interest rates. Everything is accepted, but the system has not collapsed. Banks did not collapse because they did not have the oligarchs, which would start to save themselves at the cost of the society and the state. And let's say take the money from the state system. But this reform continues. We need the really strong regulator, the level of the National Bank of Ukraine, and sorry, and this is going to be done manually in the beginning. We cannot generate ideal laws and wait. Nobody is going to adopt that. We are going to fight for that. With decisions, correct or not correct, with some errors made, the mistakes made, in order to adopt the laws which could protect those decisions, etc. This is not a clean job, like let's say the plumber, for example. They will be working in very dirty conditions, but it's high time to do something in the real sector. This is a good example how we made this banking sector clean. We have to make it a real sector which is going to finance economy. It's not the case so far, but it's high time to put everything in order in the banking sector. As soon as we do that, and I hope that we are going to do that, and I appreciate the Prime Minister and the President of Ukraine. They became leaders in that, and the MPs should not be afraid to do that. And I hope in this case, in 4 or 5 years from now, we'll have a normal real sector, not dominated by oligarchs. I worked also in the Council of the National Bank of Ukraine. Since 2015, none of the oligarchs would call an substance from view. But now they have some interest in the anti-monopoly committee. The anti-monopoly committee must become a strong regulator to help the law enforcement bodies to put everything in order. I'm not talking about punishing somebody or ruining somebody's property rights or whatever. What I'm talking about, like in the banking system, we have to introduce the real rules of the game for all the people to stick, to adhere to those rules. This is really correct and right to do.
Thank you very much. I would like to add from myself that opening of the banking system happened in 2008. Before that, for decades, country was operating without knowing the beneficial owners of specific banks. They would appear and disappear, reappear. A common. There is an example of a bank that was driven out of the market, not because it wasn't capitalized, had lacked a business model, or did anything illegal, but because there was an MP as beneficial owner getting funding from the Swiss banks, tens or hundreds of $millions, and he decided that he didn't want to show his beneficial ownership, and the bank was actually driven out of the market because the license was withdrawn. Transparency is important. Then we know who the beneficial owners or any kind of business for that matter. Transparency is very important, but in Ukraine, abiding by the rules is the most difficult game. It's a phenomenon of our country in our time. Thank you, but I would like Mikhail Saakashvili to share his experience with us, because Mr. Saakashvili is a witness of fighting oligarchs in Georgia. For the period of your presidency, Mr. Saakashvili, fighting oligarchs in Ukraine, using Odessa region, and at this point you continue your operations in a different capacity, and you are very critical about the situation that is developing in your native country, in Georgia. And I have a question, whether winning once is enough. Is it anything sustainable for such regions to never come back to the old ways? Well, I can tell you that President Zelensky for the first time started talking about the oligarchy. This is a historic fact. We knew about the elephant in the room, but nobody would mention the animal, not to offend anyone. So Alexei Daniil should not be too shy. This is done through his council, because all the state apparatus, the rest of it is dysfunctional. We are discussing law enforcement and the corruption bodies, but National Anti-Corruption Bureau is the only exception on and National Agency for Prevention of Corruption. That's why they attacked 10 judges were put in prison because of NABU operations. Before that, for decades, we had very few odd cases. And I think this is a politional secret. The most important thing is with the oligarchs. I would reinforce this law. We point to oligarchs, we define oligarchs, but the oligarchs have to admit that they are oligarchs. If they do not admit, then we file a criminal case and then we prosecute. Do you believe in this opportunity? This is elementary. This is one provision of the law. You change the law and you have a different reality, not about recognizing, admitting, not admitting. You have to claim that you are an oligarch. Otherwise, it's criminal liability. This is one thing. And secondly, the most important problem is that the economy is very bureaucratic. Oligarchs live in the flora and fauna, in the marshes, in the swamps, breeding oligarchy. They provide all the opportunities because both sides know this only way to prosper and to stay afloat. If we don't change the state apparatus, nothing can happen. We have to do it through the court system. The only exception is plant inspections. And we have to adopt this law on entrepreneurship. The rest of the business agents should be freed and excused if you have a license and permits removed and unnecessary ones, and the majority of them are unnecessary. If you do not receive positive response to your timely application, you automatically become a legal operator. And if we have all the borders, we have all the tracks, why people have to go from one door to another. And when I was given back my citizenship, I had to code 5 agencies with my military records. It should be done automatically. It should come to your home, be on your email, and you are not supposed to go to any kind of agencies in person, any commissaries, and free movement of capital. National Bank of Ukraine, why should we limit the current cash operations? The money coming in and out of the country. So why should it be limited? It's a natural pulse of economy. I can say that we have the parallel system of money transfers. You can make a transaction for 30 million without any problems using this specific informal network. You can transfer any kind of money, but to do it in a clean way, you need a permit from the National Bank of Ukraine. This is a ridiculous norm which should be immediately removed. Regulatory impact assessment, audit of all the bureaucratic acts for 2 months or 3 months at maximum, and we have to cut all the unnecessary ones off. It's more than 50%, I'm sure. And then you won't have any flora and fauna for breeding monsters in this world. Peculiar animals. Anyway, thank you for touching upon this very sensitive subject. Let's not call them animals, but potential players in big business, potential investors, because we have seen certain statements to that effect, and we hope that they won't have any. They won't be demotivated to invest. They will just do it in a different way for the sake of our country, for the sake of every individual citizen. Another thing I would like to draw attention to is the fact that oligarchy is based on raw material-based economies, or rooted in such economies, and all the operations should be transparent, the register should be merged, and they should be readily available without any unnecessary filters. We have done a lot along those lines, and this transparency at the end of the day should become the regulator or one of the regulators leading to devastation of oligarchy. And thank you for this discussion. Thank you for doing this great thing, being curators and drivers of the important process. Timothy Milovanov mentioned the banking system. I have calculated that from the disclosure of beneficiaries to real cleansing, we need at least 10 years. Let's be more effective, let's be fast, and every one of us will join this this very important process. The same is true with culture readiness of the society for the change in question. If we ask ourselves whether everyone of us is individually ready for simplification, streamline, are we ready for this? And let's follow the suit of Mr. Malavanos and not answer the calls which are not transparent. Let's not undermine the culture of de-oligarchization. And Ukraine should become twice as wealthy, and every one of us will have part of it. Thank you, dear participants, and you're invited to go to the press room to talk to our leading media, and in a couple of minutes we'll have a continuation of discussions. We'll discuss the legislative framework to fight oligarchy. According to the presidential, the law on de-oligarchization will set the rules of interplay for the big business sectors with the government and serve as the first step to liquidate the oligarchy in Ukraine. Based on this law, they will develop the antitrust laws on lobbyism, the law on lobbyism and other statutes to reset the economic and societal relations in this country. At this point, they announced the package of another 7 drafts to follow the previous offer.
Dear participants and guests of our forum, in a few minutes from now we're going to restart our work, so please, we are expecting you in the main conference room. Please come there and be seated.
Це Всеукраїнський форум Україна 30, і далі ми переходимо в нашому обговоренні.
In our discussion, we switch over to the next discussion and next session. Legislative base for combating oligarchs. I give the floor to moderator, Deputy Chairperson of the Parliamentary Committee on Anti-Corruption Policy, MP Halina Yanchenko. Thank you. Esteemed colleagues, do not hesitate and take your seats in our conference hall. We are going to continue to discuss one of the most important topics, the legislative initiative of the President of Ukraine regarding the de-oligarchization. As you have noticed, over the last 2 years, the presidential team is consistent in demonstrating political will and sometimes non-standard approaches to such transformations. In draft law and the legislative initiatives which are discussing today is one of those legislative transformations and changes. I suggest that we should discuss today the draft law which has been submitted by the President of the Parliament and whether it would be enough. I mean, only this one draft law in order once and for all let's say eradicate such a phenomenon as oligarchy from our political and social life, to make those measures integral and transparent and introduce the same rules for everyone and separate the policy from politics from business. This is the objective of most of the reform prepared by the President. This is something which the Parliament and the government work on today, and both Parliament and the government have repeatedly demonstrated their preparedness to create more transparent conditions for everyone. We can see that in the initiatives regarding the transparency of the markets. Let's recall the land reform, the initiatives on the alcohol sector and the amber. The same initiative have been initiated in the, let's say, state public governance, reform of decentralization, and sphere of the state, the service provided by the state, digitalization, and the means of, which actually transforms the state and makes it a digital service provider. And let's recall what was the beginning of the Verkhovna Rada of this convocation. Let's say the lift of the let's say impunity and the responsibility issues which the Parliament works today on. Starting our panel discussion, we can say that when this initiative has been submitted, there was some skeptical attitude to that on the part of the experts and bloggers. However, when we familiarized with that process, we get more positive, let's say, assessment, including the international, let's say, foreign colleagues. So I suggest we should start the discussion. Give the floor to Ruslan Stefanchuk, first deputy chairman of the Verkhovna Rada. So the first question to you, Ruslan. What do you think? This kind of very turbulent response on the part of the community to that issue, what was the reason for that? And speaking about this draft law, how we can make all the skeptics into the followers and supporters of this presidential initiative. Thank you. Good afternoon, dear participants of the forum. The topic we are discussing today is very urgent, topical for the country as a whole. Why? Because over the 30 last years, the system we have been building in Ukraine, this is the system of preferences, privileges, uncomprehended, let's say, playing into the hands of the players. And they started in the end of the 1990s. They started to create a certain caste of the persons who started to enrich themselves, not only from the economic point of view. They wanted to turn their economic assets into the political influence, media influence, which will further enrich them. And this system has been forming for a number of years. And that's why a very important segment of the program of President Ukraine and the People Party, the oligarchization, which after liberalization, this became, they made a notion existing in our society. As you aptly mentioned, they started the large public discussion. I would break it down into the discussion when the people understand there is a chance to get the equal rules for everyone and eliminate the big evil which exists in Ukraine, oligarchs. How we can eliminate that? Not using the Bolshevist slogans, let's ruin everything and then, but to create the equal rules when from the status of oligarchs can switch over to the status of big businessmen. We have a lot of different privileges. But just to get rid of their influence on the policy, on the mass media, and make them to act in compliance with antitrust legislation, do everything possible so that they use the efforts not to create the market of the political parties. This is in a country where there is a market of political parties, but to multiply their businesses, to increase their business in honest tax payment to the budget of Ukraine. But I would like to draw attention to the second component of this resonance. When the people who started to say that this is the law against themselves, in criminal law, it's called let's say pleading guilty, and they say that this law is against them. But this law is not directed against oligarchs themselves, but to the people who surround them, who created comfortable conditions for their life. They have them, they lobby their interests in the parliament, etc., etc. So this law is, first of all, against those people. What mechanism you suggest? Mechanism of openness. There is no more powerful mechanism than this mechanism of openness. We're not talking about the lifelong sanctions or, let's say, the capital punishment. No. If you have a contact with an oligarch, you must publicly actually publicize the fact of this contact. If you are entered in the register as an oligarch, you have a number of different restrictions associated with this status. You have to submit an annual declaration. You have other restrictions regarding your participation in political activity or media activity. When they introduced the declaration for the civil servants, there was a big resistance. They didn't want to do that. But now it's a normal thing. They actually demonstrate their assets, and it's almost impossible to hide them away. And now this is no less oligarchs than just ordinary clerk on the level of the village council. Why those people have to fill in those declarations of oligarch? Not. A very important element fixed in this draft law we actually try to persuade people not to continue to be oligarchs. For some period of time, they have to get rid of some of the assets, to say no to some of their influence on the mass media, on the political component, and start to deal with the big business. This is a chance of, well, generally speaking, the policy we pursue this is to provide the same chances for everyone. We adopted the presidential draft law, the null declaration, which gives chance to everyone. Unfortunately, for 30 years, it was impossible to let's say, to crowd the honest or integral business. We actually give them a chance to go through this kind of the cleaning procedure. You just have to start to honestly pay your taxes and build a democratic society in Ukraine. This is the issue of the draft law. The law has been submitted to the Verkhovna Rada. This is not the only draft law. There will be others to follow. We are working on the systemic changes with antitrust legislation, or the legislation on political parties, the legislation associated with the owning, let's say, being the owner of the mass media channels. This is something deals with our vision how to the process of de-oligarchization for Ukraine to get rid of this oligarchian influence in Ukraine. All of us MPs and the government officers, we are prepared and ready for the dialogue. But we have to take this first step in order to have the rules which would make everyone equal in the face of the law and the court. And I do hope that we will be successful in that. Speaking of other legislative initiatives, we are going to get back to the oligarchization with Andrei Kosin. Ruslan, your question to you, if you're talking about the first initiative, this framework law, it's been submitted by the president, something which is really urgent. When the Verkhovna Rada will have a chance to consider that draft law in the first reading, and what kind of field we are going to have will be big enough for the legislative discussion.
We plan till the end of the session, we have 3 weeks in the parliament, this one, and next one, and another one after that. So we will at least try to adopt this draft this week, and if it is not spammed with a big surge of amendments, we now try to adopt it, and this will to a very large degree depend on the developments of discussions and this session. De-oligarchization is the Ukrainian topic. Of course, it's a joke, but discussing in a more serious way the risks for this initiative. You mentioned, Dennis, that one of the possible risks is in oligarchs reassigning their key assets to different people, or registering under different people, real people. And how can we prevent this risk? And we would like to know whether the Ministry of Justice, your ministry, has any such levers, deterrents. Let's discuss the know-how first. What is know-how and what is not? Know-how is something, and this is the first time in the world's history, at least I can conclude that from my analysis of the literature, this is for the first time oligarch becomes a legal term. And this is not a bad name, a raider, a hooligan. This is a law with the criteria and the register, and we can clearly tell whether a particular person falls or does not fall under this category, but when they are registered as oligarchs, we will face the stage when this is not a know-how anymore, because in the Western law and Western case law, we have the declarations of different categories, different forms and different procedures, nothing extraordinary there, and even limiting the influence over media. Over media, of course, there are some precedents of such separation of big business from the media. In many Western countries, there are direct prohibitions for ownership of media, the cross-ownership and concentration of ownership. There's this big TV, radio, and press component. There are some limitations for such big holdings, media holdings, and this cross-holding. This is not new also, but having this as a draft with the legal definition of oligarch, this is one of the many innovations that we introduced, and there we are leading the hand, so to speak. But, of course, we have mentioned many such occasions in this very room and in this very building. Now, can we really block any incentives for the oligarchs to reassign their assets formally, to do private banking for themselves, in plain English? Well, there is an chance of such rearrangement. One of the important barriers, though, is that the new owner of a medium can be, according to the definition of oligarchs, is a person with spotless business reputation. The criteria are derived from the banking legislation. Most importantly, as we can see currently, the principle, the approach to this immaculate reputation or goodwill worked perfectly well. There are no offshores, there are no intermediary and they point to their real beneficial owners, the banks do, and the ones that fail to do so are driven from out of the market. So with this approach, we cherish hopes that we will be able to do the same for the media and for the alienation of assets and reassignment of the assets to suppose that the different owners, new owners, should buy at the market value with the funds which are perfectly legal and documented to that effect. That's our way to safeguard the situation. And there's a big body of risks for the oligarchs if they have a set of assets attached to them, some companies, TV networks, licenses, some real estate. They understand that they should behave themselves, be perfectly legal, and then the property cannot be taken away from me. If I reassign this to some Mr. Smith or John Doe, I cannot guarantee at some point that this person is not sanctioned for some odd irregularity, or there's no criminal history, or we quarrel and this person will try to take this asset away from me for their own purposes. And the taxation difficulties and so forth. So that creates the risks for the title of ownership. So for the oligarchs, it's much safer to separate their business from politics, and the media work as a business person, not to generate excessive risks, and the state will be there to respect this ownership, legal ownership, legitimate ownership, and will not interfere with the clean business people who, in their turn, do not interfere with big politics for the purposes of their business. So speaking of this draft on de-oligarchization, the time span is 10 years. Is it enough, do you think, to get rid of the phenomenon of oligarchy? And this is, this is the origin of capitals. It used to be historically murky, also because we had that thoughtless and very strange voucher privatization and transferring big assets to some dubious personalities or cases of nepotism and protectionism. Well, with the status of oligarch, as soon as we remove its status, remove the influence of big business and come back to the civilized operation, we won't have any prerequisite for arrival of new oligarchs, because some people, the smartest, the cleverest, or the least scrupulous at some point. The law is temporary, it's a good thing. The span of 10 years is the right choice also, because this is the time not just for the oligarchs to become less so, and the regulator will become much stronger, the anti-monopoly committee. That's the plan anyway. And after 10 years, as we expect, we'll have some classical regulation as they have in well-developed and established democracies, because we have the same starting point, country without oligarchs. Why would me, for example, copy any laws from Western Europe? Because this phenomenon is not there. Oligarchy is something that is inherent for post-colonial countries, post-Soviet, which is basically the same thing. And this has been discussed in the literature dedicated to the notion of oligarchy. So in France and Germany, there's no such history, there's no such law, and now case law for that matter. For this period of time, for the modern media, the legal technique, legal toolkit, that's the case. Andrei Kostin, head of the Parliamentary Committee on Legal Policy. I have a question for you. The first initiative of the President's, but what should reinforce this initiative on the side of the Parliament? Perhaps the government will come back later to the Minister of Justice. What else should be adopted, developed, and then adopted for the initiative to work? Thank you, Helena. Before I answer this question, let me just give you one example for you to better understand the philosophy behind this draft. Let's compare society to a human body. People sometimes feel that something is wrong with their health status, but they have no time or no will or no courage to face this problem and start solving it. The only thing is diagnostics. So that's the only way to go. So if we understand that the oligarchy type of state is a disease of our country, is a plague, we can understand that we need diagnostics. When we developed this draft, we had such diagnostics, and that was true also for our exploration of the background different jurisdictions. So this oligarchy, this oligarchical type of state has different features, peculiar features, the monopoly, the big wealth, the political influence, and the media influence. That's the combination, that's the classical diagnosis of this disease, which is called oligarchy. And the draft law, in its philosophy, designs a certain cure, a certain treatment for this disease. And we understand that for this period we can improve the situation, first of all, let's therapeutically, meaning that we can diagnose the oligarchs and tell who is an oligarch and who is not. And after that therapy, after getting rid of some criteria, they can stop being that. And they can take care of their big businesses, however big. But if the therapy fails, you can apply to surgery, and you can recognize a person as an oligarch and apply certain limitations under the law, certain constraints or restraints under the law. But we understand that any disease and its treatment is not over, even with the surgical intervention, or not to mention the first therapy. This is also the convalescence. This is something that we should take care of with the drafts under discussion. We understand that for this time span, for the 10 years, we have not just to adopt, but also to implement and enforce the changes, so that in 10 years all of us can just say that in this country we have no oligarchs to speak of, and they cannot reappear. And what we can see under this package, this is an open one. At this point, we cannot say that it consists of 5 or 10 legislative acts, but we understand that by all means this is a way to further improve the anti-monopoly legislation, because this very set of laws, more than 100 years ago, helped the United States to start this fight with their oligarchs back then. Let's just remind ourselves of Theodore Dreiser's trilogy, Financier, Titan, and Stoicism. And that's how more than 100 years ago a business person became an oligarch, and how it all turned out for this person and for the country. But we have no 100 years, so we have to use a parallel way. First, we have to improve the anti-monopoly legislation. We understand that many cases having to do with the abuse of your monopoly situation reviewed by courts, the results are not to satisfaction of the society nor the state for the matter. So one of the instruments is referring such cases to a different tribunal, and this draft has been discussed. And this is would be another forum specialized in a certain category of cases. And with the findings of the Anti-Monopoly Committee, with a fine for a couple of billions hryvnias, at the end of the day, they can get this And so I find that is many times bigger in a different order. This is continuation of work on development of, let's say, and this is for the all the issues having to do with lobbyism. This is a difficult topic by all means, and we realize that this is a long way to go and a difficult one to regulate this issue. And the legislation on lobbyism is not something like regulating an illegal influence. This is about any kind of contact between business and the stakeholders and decision making, legislative or regulatory, should be transparent and accountable. And this is the first step on combating oligarchs. And this has to do with the necessity and the duty to report on any kind of contact, but we have to improve all the system. And we know, all of you, and we and myself, how many changes to the law on communications are suggested, and there is always suspicion of a hidden agenda, and we have to adopt this draft to regulate lobbyism.
Everything which is not going to be regulated, this is going beyond the boundaries of the law. This is very important. We also understand that we have to further improve legislation related to the activity of the judicial system, and the first draft laws are going to be considered already in the second reading this week and until the completion of this plenary session in the parliament. We also understand that we have to further improve the legislation related to the opportunity to own certain media resources. By the way, in the United States, after the first wave of antitrust laws, they adopted the respective regulations associated with the ownership of the media resources in order for those media resources not to be used as a means of political influence. We understand that this issue is rather sensitive. However, for me, this is very interesting. For example, how much the respective media resources can cost, those which belong to certain oligarchs. We can talk about huge money. For example, they pass a decision to get rid of those resources, not to continue to be oligarchs during this period of therapy, to stop being an oligarch. And you know, there is a certain fear, maybe not fear, but rather understanding of the fact that many media resources, they are like business. They don't, as business, they do not work. They work only because they are financed additionally or funded additionally by their owners in order to be used as a means of political influence. But the business must be equal in any sphere, whether we are talking about the mining industry or the production or manufacturing some of the commodities, or be them mass media. There must be a free competition in any business sphere. One more point I would like to emphasize. We hear a lot that our foreign partners have a great disbelief or lack of trust to different state institutions, including the judicial institutions. But I would like to give you an example showing that it is the availability of oligarch system let's say, do not allow the many foreign companies to enter Ukrainian market because they understand that they will find themselves in non-competitive environment. They can offer better technologies, clean technologies. They can offer a new culture, tax culture, the new culture of communicating with the state authorities, which is absolutely badly required by Ukrainian business. But they will not come here if they understand that they won't be able to get competitive, equal access to any resources equal with the Ukrainian businessman, which possibly is controlled by the oligarch capital. That's why this draft law, among other things, deals with providing equal conditions for entering Ukrainian market for everyone, including the big foreign investors. Thank you. Thank you. One of the widely used term, oligarch, defines those people who concentrate in their hands a certain monopoly situation in different sectors of economy to increase their influence, and then they use this influence to increase their assets. This kind of the closed loop situation. That's why antitrust and anti-monopoly legislation must be strengthened within the framework of this initiative. Dear speakers, in your opinion, to which extent this legislation is efficient? We are talking about the antitrust legislation, whether it's modern, and what transformations or methods must be adopted. Okay, me myself as a representative of the government, because anti-monopoly is the executive branch of power. Well, there is a list of norms, I will put this way, on the powers, authorities of the Anti-Monopoly Committee, which could be or should be strengthened. And the draft law has been registered in the Parliament, which has been worked on by the Anti-Monopoly Committee and then submitted to the Parliament for their consideration. So the first wave, let's say, has been considered by the specialists and experts. I can say that the Anti-Monopoly Committee today doesn't have any rights. Just to give an example, just today, my colleagues told me that there was the penalty for 100 million hryvnia for one the company. It was immediately fulfilled, this requirement. So they have to defend their decisions, the decisions which rather quickly the executive authorities can actually realize or implement. No, not always those are the success stories. In our practice, we repeatedly actually imposed hundreds of million hryvnia fines or penalties. When we are talking about the billion upon billion penalties, they were either not fulfilled or being removed from the agenda, let's say. Andrei was talking about the let's say, placing the complaint against the decision or rule in the court through some other court. They try to defend the decision of Anti-Monopoly Committee so that the IMC could be more, feel themselves more confident. Including, let's say, the cases when there is not always understandable arguments they use, As regards the current authorities of MAC, they are rather big, potentially big, but again, their practice of implementation somewhat is lame, so to say, and those nuances should be improved, or let's say removed, to make the Anti-Monopoly Committee and their decisions more serious, more robust, more solid as they are today. So when the decisions taken by the MNC it's very serious, and we are talking about billion plus sums of money, there is minimum chance that they will be defended such rights. Well, the practice, unfortunately, shows that. I would like to echo and add to what Dennis mentioned. You know, we understand, just to give an example, professional, kind of resistance or argument between the AMC and the Monopoly Committee and let's put it, this big business. If we are talking about the hundreds of millions of hryvnia penalty, in order to resolve this argument in a fair manner, not only all of us have to trust the respective court. The court cannot take the position of any of the parties involved. If one of the parties cannot prove its the certain circumstances, it cannot defend their position rather professionally or professionally enough, then even the court doesn't have any opportunity, let's say, an opportunity, but to pass a decision in favor of another party. When they cannot involve top-notch, highly professional lawyers who can find a lot of reasons in order for let's say, to torpedo the decision taken by this court, or to reconsider this decision. What I mean to say, we as a state have to take care of the quality of protection of the decision taken by the Anti-Monopoly Committee. This is the issue of resources, and also the payment for the work of those members of the Anti-Monopoly Committee. And this payment must be increased in order to involve top-notch or highly skilled lawyers who would represent the interests of the Anti-Monopoly Committee during the court. In the court, when we are talking about this kind of the disputes, any organization, any business won't try to save the money to hire the best, the top-notch lawyers. This is number one. Well, I understand that the AMC, fulfilling its duties, can actually add to the state budget, filling that with the respective penalties, and this money is sufficient to give part of that money to the Anti-Monopoly Committee as a resource in order to improve the judicial, let's say, support of their cases. This is really important. But this entails another consequence. We understand when we are talking about the huge penalty, we are talking not about punishment or punishing certain behavior or somebody who abuses their position. We are not talking about the structure who is going to pay this penalty. It has another function. All the rest, all others will understand. For this similar behavior, the penalty will not be 300 million, 100 million hryvnia, but 300 million hryvnia. And then such abuse cases will diminish or decrease in their number. There is another draft law related to very big penalties and the possibility to find a compromise between the state and the structure which abuses this monopoly status, because in some situations can be resolved in favor of the state in such a way that the state can actually be penalized or receives the penalty. Maybe not that big as was calculated by the Anti-Monopoly Committee, but the structure which will, let's say, plead guilty or recognize its mistake, they will not. They will have be given the chance to continue their business, and the jobs will not be lost. But in this case, we will understand that this structure recognizes that they plead guilty. Maybe some of the structure will not agree to that, but we are talking about the cases when they agree that we were guilty, we actually abused our position, and we are prepared to pay the penalty, maybe a bit less than the one estimated by the MNC. We are talking about the proper dialogue between the state and the big business. Thank you. If we actually sum up our panel discussion, let's recall that Vladimir Zelensky, during all his travel into the politics, he came up with a number of resolute initiatives. One of his initiatives was about the, let's say, lifting the impunity, let's say, whether the parliament will be prepared to restrict their authorities. But anyway, that was the first the first case when they adopted this, and now we can see about that they can feel the action with this law themselves. Ruslan, you're representative of the president in the parliament. What can we expect of parliament in the context of supporting this draft law, this initiative, de-oligarchization? Should we expect that somebody is going to offer resistance, and who exactly in this case? You know, over the 2 years of my work in the parliament, I became, from the optimist, I transformed into the realist. We are going to have a very serious fight in all the front lines, but you know, we have the political will on the highest level of the state. We have political will in the parliament. I do hope that all the rest, all the conditions will become not really tangible or significant, and this will be a breaking point for them to understand whether we're going to have some transformations in this country or not. And this is kind of the life is certain fact for the future, first of all, economical future of our country. I'm sure that there will be some resistance in different factions, different groups, and this actually demonstrates that we are on the right road. But we have to make the first steps, and after the first steps to take other steps. Somebody mentioned that this anti-monopoly legislation. I also would like to emphasize the issue of formation of legislation on lobbyism and advocacy, because if, as of today, if today we had such legislation, then many MPs, members of other structures would be forced to declare themselves as lobbyists. Many former politicians, which from the legal point of view are not worth anything, but they still support these or other persons. They would have to recognize themselves to be lobbyists. They would have to demonstrate their assets and honestly pay their taxes for those assets. These are the first steps which will be followed by other steps, but this is not going to be an easy travel. This will be a serious battle for the future of this country. But I'm optimistic, and I believe that we will become victorious and we'll get on the equal rules for everyone. And this is the end of our session. We had the speakers, Ruslan Stefanchuk, First Deputy Chairman of the Verkhovna Rada, Denis Malutska, Minister of Justice of Ukraine, and Andrei Kostin, Chairman of the Parliamentary Law Enforcement Committee. Thank you. This is the second day of Ukraine 40 Forum this week. See you tomorrow. Thank you.